Welcome. Today presenting to you is Kelly Smith, myself, Nydia Johnson, and Chibiko Nuabeli, and we'll be discussing the topic on racism. According to Wu, racism is the sum of ways that society discriminates and commits violence against Black people. It withholds justice, fairness, and resources. It demeans and gaslights. Racism in this case is considered as a noun. The inability or refusal to recognize the rights, needs, dignity, or value of people of particular races or geographical origins. In this picture, we see an African American male drinking water. And what makes this picture unique is that it indicates what it was like in the Jim Crow era. On his left, it has a sign that says white women, colored women. On his right, white men and colored men. It seems as is indicating where Black women and men can drink their water. It's funny because, or not funny, but Black women and men, like depicted in the picture, was only able to drink tap water in certain establishments, white establishments, and where white women and men were able to receive ice cold water, if they shall please. Let's play a little game of Who Said It. I am going to read you a quote and I want for you to guess who it may have came from. At the end of the presentation, the person will be revealed. So let's take a toe touch dive into the topic of racism. I would like for you to think to yourself and answer the question, what does racism mean to me? The quote reads, deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the Black of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. To these objections, which are political, may be added others which are physical and moral. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. So, where did racism come from? The conception of dividing people by race begins with the slave trade. This thing was so shocking, so opposed to all of the conceptions of society, which religion and philosophers had, that the only justification by which humanity could face it was to divide people into races and decide that the Africans were an inferior race. Racism has started long before the European settlers began to colonize Africa and import the African people to work for free in America. But so that is where we are going to begin our presentation. Racism is very similar and it goes along with being institutionalized with the slave trade dated as far back in the early 16th century. There were slave trade to the New World of 12.5 million Africans. 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage on their way to North America, the Caribbean, and South America. The question is, how many slaves were transported directly to the United States? You guessed it, 388,000. Gives a new perspective of what is considered a small percentage. In Jim Crow eras, in order to oppress the newly freed slaves, the South quickly enacted Jim Crow laws that were meant to continue the legacy of economic and social oppression. And with race, technology, and medicine, measles outbreaks, rabies, cesarean procedures, and syphilis were all improved by none other than African American slaves. It is built on the lives of countless slaves. Imagine a world where drugs comes to market within years instead of decades. A world where experimental procedures are perfected in hours instead of years. Everyone is familiar on rats and pigs in pre-human trials. But before there were human rights activists, there were slaves that were used for experimentation trials. In this slide, we'll be talking about the many and different types of racism, from cultural racism, individual racism, institutional racism, and internalized racism. Cultural racism is when the public blindly accepts preconceived notions about an ethnic group. Individual racism is when one has developed their own bias towards an ethnic group that isn't based on logical reasoning. Institutional or systemic racism is a cultural collusion towards undermining a particular ethnic group. You can see in the black and white picture down on the lower left-hand corner is a perfect example of institutional racism. Internalized racism, this one is a different term. I would say is used more of has a more of an Uncle Tom stance, where it's popularized by the famous movie, The King and I, in which Uncle Tom, a person of color, is portrayed as having internalized the Deep South racism that he was raised in and therefore became a perpetuator of that racism. Here in pictures on the right, you see different types of racism. We have redlining on the very top right-hand corner. This map is actually a map of Chicago, Illinois, where they have mapped out where African Americans reside, and you see how they color coded. That is to keep them in a particular area, in one designated area. On the left, with us voting we are all in the middle of a campaign and to vote for our new election for 2020. Perfect example of that would be Kentucky, as their poll booths were moved further out from making it inaccessible to a lot of the African American communities that live among the inner cities. The middle picture, we see a Caucasian male walking on top of the line. Easy, no worries. But on the right-hand side, the African American male is looking up at the white male, wondering how he can get above the lines to walk on the lines as well. And then down on the bottom right-hand corner, we see the different types of blackface that has been on the main screen in Hollywood, from Jim Crow era all the way to our modern day. Racism is dehumanizing. It's simply denying one's true identity. The denial of knowing that a person, in this case, a person of color, is a human being is what is meant to dehumanize an individual. We often find ourselves trying to find excuses for someone's irrational behavior of dehumanizing another person. Like, for instance, well, maybe they didn't mean it that way. Or they must have had a hard day. Or you must have misread the situation. Or they might be dealing with some hard times. This is not the case. Racism is always one-way street. People with less melanin discriminates against a person that have more melanin. Dehumanizing does not make skin color priority. It doesn't make any difference. So why is racism a public health issue?
Race in COVID-19, the burden of genetics. According to Cornell University Health Journal, racism is lethal and it kills Black Americans, Indigenous, and other people of color. It is also subtle, put them in a perpetual socioeconomic conditions, fueling inequalities and access to basic needs. Who is most affected? We are aware that there are many different racial, ethnic groups that have experienced racism during some point in their life. And each is a different form of racism. According to the quote from American proverb, the child who is not embraced by the warmth of the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Who is most affected? Black African Americans. Racial profiling, it doesn't just cover the color of someone's skin. The tools of oppression are well known now. Redlining is used to divide the voices of those that might dissent. Racial profiling has been perpetuated since the beginning of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In the genius of the Jim Crow laws that were passed 20 years later, it has been made evident by mainstream media that black protesters and white rioters are treated completely different by the police. Now imagine what happens when there's no cameras around and what happens to those disenfranchised people. Who is most affected? Asian Americans, because the nation of Japan attacked the nation of America. The media headlines help perpetuate the cultural stigma towards anyone that ties to Japan. No matter how loose the ties were, whether it be named or percentage of stigma of still negativity. During COVID-19, the President of the United States of America coined the term China virus, which the media often quoted and indirectly perpetuated the stimulation association between SARS-2 virus and people of China descent. Sometimes racial stereotypes cut into another direction. Take an example, the dilemma of the Harvard enrollment office, when it required the enrollment of a certain ratio of ethnic groups to provide a diverse student population. The competition is high, so high in fact that the disproportionate amount of Asians are denied enrollment even when their academic surpasses the majority of other ethnic groups applying for the university. Who is most affected? Latino Americans, because of the generalization of Central and South Americans of Mexicans in their association with blue-collar work. Racism is a public health issue when you consider the health impact of poverty on lifespan. The average age of a minority is significantly less than the majority. So yes, racism is undeniably a public health issue. Black Americans make up 30% of the U.S. COVID-19 patients. Black Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population. Public health is built on the principle in improving the health of people in their communities. As we continue to endure the COVID-19 pandemic, we have discovered the disproportionate raise on health and economic stability of the Black community. For every 100,000 Americans, about 108 Blacks have died from the coronavirus, the highest actual mortality rate of all groups. Asian is 45%, whites 54%, Pacific Islanders 69%, Latinos 74%, and indigenous people 90%. There is a disproportionate amount of minorities that work in the essential services, For example, nurses, waiters, and grocery clerks. Being a public face, they are now in a high risk of being exposed to COVID-19. The proof is in the statistics. There has been studies that show that racism can cause health problems. Mental health, anxiety and depression, internal health, gastrointestinal issues, heart disease, stroke and diabetes, external health, skin rashes. In this year of 2020, it has challenged us and had brought health inequities into the public eye. We have COVID-19 to thank for that, although we still have much to learn. Racism and mental health is a vital discussion that surrounds the Black and African American communities. From African American men being used in the Tuskegee study of syphilis to all, if not most African Americans, experience health inequity from doctors and other medical professionals. It is no wonder why most African Americans distrust the healthcare system, that anything is wrong with them. African American health statistics. These disparities are not a result of individual or group behavior, but decades of systematic inequality in American healthcare systems. In this fact sheet sheds light on some of the most persistent inequalities facing African Americans or Black Americans. In this health chart, African Americans range highest from health problems such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke by the time they get to the age of 50, compared to their white counterparts. Why does it seem as if health still has yet to show any improvement in African American health? Among African Americans, as well as other racial and ethnic minority groups, they are often reluctant and timid to seek health care because they distrust the government and healthcare systems due to the many years of maltreatment and historical events such as the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in African American males and the sterilization without people's permission. Environmental racism is a disproportionate impact on environmental hazards on people of color. According to Green Action, the environmental justice movement states that environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lacks enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. Environmental racism is caused by several factors, including intentional neglect and alleged need for receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and a lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. It is a well-documented fact that communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by polluting industries, in particular hazardous waste facilities, and lacks regulation of these industries. My personal view on environmental racism in Oklahoma. Environmental racism is a social determinant of health. It is where we live, learn, worship, and play. The lack of sidewalks, crosswalks, street lights, and grocery stores on the east side of Oklahoma City. I had the opportunity to take part in a protest August 3rd, 2019 in front of Smart Savers, which was a grocery store that is now knocked down. Yes, they are building 2 new grocery stores on the east side of Oklahoma City on Northeast 23rd and Northeast 36th. But what was their reasoning of knocking down the grocery store that has been the most accessible source of food for the community for years? Some community members have lack of transportation, and the store location provided accessibility for the community for years. After the store got knocked down, they had to find, well, some people had to find means of transportation to the grocery stores that are more than 10 minutes away from their community. The east side of Oklahoma City is a primarily black community, and there are mountains of trash, also known as landfills, located in their community. There's another landfill that is primarily in a Hispanic community on the south side of Oklahoma City. That shows the lack of concern for pollution and hazardous waste on minority health. Now, please watch the video on environmental racism.
Mortality gap for U.S. moms. In the U.S., black women who are expecting or who are new mothers die at rates similar to those of the same women in lower income countries, while the maternal rate for white U.S. moms more closely resembles rate in more affluent countries. Maternal mortality in African American women is a huge racial issue in the United States of America. The epidemiology statistics show that black women in the U.S. have 40 maternal deaths per 100,000 deaths, and white women in the U.S. have 12.4 maternal deaths per 100,000 deaths. Now that's a 27.6 point difference between the two racial stats of maternal death for black and white women in the United States. For infant mortality, African American infant mortality is twice the rate for white infants. According to the Century Foundation, African American infant mortality rate is twice compared to white infants. This is due to the disparity in healthcare coverage. From this slide, we can see that non-Hispanic blacks have 11 deaths per 1,000 live births, and non-Hispanic whites have 4.7 deaths per 1,000 live births. There are 25 states that have not declared racism as a public health crisis or issue. Oklahoma is one of them, and the question is, why do you think that is the case? According to the video, racism is a public health crisis. Now that we see What Do We Do by Kamara Phyllis Jones. The first state to declare racism as a public health issue was Wisconsin in May 2019. The second was Illinois in July 2019. The third, Missouri in August 2019. Fourth, Maryland, November 2019. The fifth was Pennsylvania, December 2019. The sixth was Ohio, May 2020. By June 2020, Texas, Washington, Nevada, California, Arizona, Colorado, Nebraska, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Tennessee, and North Carolina declared it, and this was due to the death of George Floyd, which triggered states to become aware. By July 2020, Georgia. By September 2020, Florida declared racism as a public health crisis. 25 out of 50 states have at least a city or county with jurisdiction declaring racism is a public health crisis, Ohio being in the lead with 18 jurisdiction declaration. Evidence-based programs. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, is one of the programs that is helping to fight racism in the United States. This was founded in February 12, 1909. The issues NAACP focus on are federal advocacy, environmental and climate justice, economic opportunity, criminal justice, education, health, and media diversity. Their mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health and well-being of all persons. Their vision is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights without discrimination based on race. Their objective is to achieve equality of rights and eliminate race prejudice among the citizens of the United States to remove all barriers of racial discrimination through democratic processes, to seek enactment and enforcement of federal, state, and local laws securing civil rights, to inform the public of the adverse effect of racial discrimination and to seek its elimination, to educate persons as to their constitutional rights, and to take all lawful actions to secure the exercise thereof, and to take any lawful action in furtherance of these objectives, consistent with the NAACP Article of Incorporation and its constitution. Black Lives Matter, BLM. The Black Lives Matter is a movement that advocates for blacks, let people know that they are not alone and that they have a voice to change injustice. Black Lives Matter is not just saying that blacks are the only lives that matter, but it shows the history of racial inequities that the black community endures. It shows that blacks are tired of racism and they want to change, but it takes the community to advocate for it. The Pride Foundation is fighting two-pronged discrimination. They ensure that priority funding for building a non-racist society goes to BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the communities where they operate. Their Crisis Community Care Fund is also targeted towards COVID-19 relief for BIPOC. They give aid, scholarships, and grants to people of color for empowerment and education. Now, what can we do to spark change? There is a 5-step SPARK model for fostering inclusiveness. In this model, it will allow us to express value and affirm each other of our authentic identity, our uniqueness. Step 1 is to make space for authenticity. It takes commitment, intention, and courage for leaders and organizations to create environments that are conducive to authenticity and humanity. Do it anyway. Step 2 is learn to be PC. No, not politically correct. Instead, be professionally competent, people-centered, and personally compassionate. The step 3 is to develop an acceptance mindset. Remember, no one wants to be tolerated, ordered, or tokenized. Step 4 is sponsor and encourage representation. Purposely include more Black Americans at the table and in positions of power. This is one of the best ways to recruit more diverse candidates across the board. Step 5 is to know your biases, both covert and overt. We all have them. Learn what's yours and do the work to overcome them.
Now that we have reached the end of the presentation, the quote from earlier came from none other than former President Thomas Jefferson. The irony is that he too had slaves and would entertain in despicable activities of inflicting pain by horsewhips and rape. He didn't have the capacity to be empathetic until he was on his deathbed. His lofty ideals were incongruent with his life's actions. Cultural racism was so pervasive during this time that it is remarkable that he decided to free his slaves upon his passing. We would like to thank everyone for listening to our presentation on the topic of racism today, presented by none other than myself, Kelly Smith, Nydia Johnson, and Chibiko Nabeli. We hope you guys have a great day.